We are still in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and we are in that section of verses 23, end of verse 23, as Paul's trying to discuss, or not trying to, he is discussing many of the things that he endured as an apostle. There's the star. I saw your picture on Facebook. All right. Robin had a tooth removed this week, and so she's feeling that a little bit. So she's not here tonight. She'll Zoom with us tomorrow. She said, I retire and now I'm falling apart. So I said, join the rest of us. No, she's not going. She's enjoying retirement way too much to go back. What's a tooth? When you can stay home and not have to work. So, all right, let's begin with a prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for the beautiful day you've given us today. We're thankful for the safe arrival of everyone here tonight. And as always, we're thankful for opportunities like this that we have to gather together, open your word together and study. We pray your presence with us and guidance as we discuss the things that Paul left for us. Please be with those of our number that are struggling with their health, who are grieving losses, and who are traveling. Keep them all safe for us and bring them back. We love you. We thank you for Jesus, and it's in his name we pray. Amen. So we emphasized last week the little preposition of the word in. And Paul is boasting. He said, I don't care what one of these you want to choose, as he's going through his, verse 22, Israelites, Abraham's descendants, servants of Christ. Whatever thing I've talked about, I'm happy to discuss with you to show you that I am not the least bit inferior to you. In fact, the whole point of this is to show his superiority. Again, there in verse 23, he said, are they this? I am more. I've worked much harder. And then he begins this. In fact, I have worked much harder is not really directly from the Greek. He would have said in labors more, in prison more frequently, in beatings more severely, in deaths again and again. And so that's the kind of the general opening that he is giving to what he's about to go through. And we are familiar with many of these things that we're going to be looking at, but we've seen records. I mean, we've seen instances, at least of some in Acts, of the beatings and the imprisonments and his labors. But where we left off last week was the last one there in verse 23, in deaths. Now the NIV has in death again and again, trying to kind of help us understand what it means. And the first three types of sufferings or hardships that he's going through are significant. But this fourth one takes it to a whole new level of superiority. But when you read that, I don't know about you, but when I read that, okay, I've worked harder, okay. I've been in prison more for, okay. I've been flogged more for, okay, all right, I can understand all that. But in deaths, how are you in deaths more than once? I mean, is he just looking at the Greek?
Well, mine says exposed to death.
Yeah, well, that's not in the Greek.
Oh.
Mine isn't either. Mine says in deaths again and again, which is probably what he means.
Yeah.
But if you're a Greek and reading this and he says in deaths and he has plural, you'd think, how does that work? Because what is death? I love it when I get silence to a question that I ask like that.
Finality.
End of
Yeah, and the Greek word is thanatos. Anybody remember what that means? It means separation. Separation. What happens when you die? Your spirit separates from your body, and so there's death. Spiritually, death, you separate from your relationship with God. And so that's a good synonym, is death for thanatos, but it actually just means separation. And so the word here is thanatos, which is plural. The Greek literally says in deaths, often. Okay? Palakis is the word here, and it means many times or frequently or often. And we know that nobody, without divine intervention, ever survives a single death. If you're dead, you're dead, unless God comes in and reverses that. That'll be the same case for all of us. We're going to die, and God's going to reverse that. So nobody survives death. But again, in my case, and probably in your translations, the translators do us a favor by saying he doesn't mean that he literally died, but he's talking about the fact that he's faced death more than one time. He's been in situations where death seemed imminent. In fact, we saw that if you go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, when we started this study, verse 9. Somebody want to read verse 9 and 10 of 2 Corinthians 1? It wouldn't be hard for you to find because it's right there in the same book. Okay, Lee?
Indeed, we have the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who rescued us from so great a danger of death, and will rescue us. He on whom we have set our hope, and he will yet deliver us.
Okay. So he said, we had the sentence of death. He was saying, we were as good as dead. The only way we were going to get out of that is on God, who raises the dead or causes death not to happen. In chapter 4, same book, verse 11. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake. I mean, he was constantly, apparently, in peril. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 32. So the Corinthians have heard this more than once, obviously. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 32. If I fought with wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink. So if he's fought with the wild beasts in Ephesus, so that would be in the arena, the Colosseum, putting in there with a bunch of lions. What would be your expectation if you were put into that arena? You would die. What if you're Daniel, put in the lion's den? You're going to die. So I think that's what he's talking about. Time and time and time again, he was placed in a situation where if he wasn't rescued from God, by God, if there wasn't some intervention, he was as good as dead. One other one, Romans chapter 8 and verse 36. And I think sometimes we take this perhaps too figuratively. Paul said, as it is written, for your sake we face death all day long, and we are considered as sheep to be slaughtered.
It says he was flogged more severely. Well, didn't they usually flog them to the point of death?
They could. They often could. Any of the things that we've talked about here, I mean, if you spend a night and a day in the deep, are you in danger of dying? Or if you're beaten severely, if you're thrown into prison? I mean, there's so many dangers, robbers, brethren, cities, country, rivers. Have you ever had to cross a rushing river and wondered whether you were going to make it or not? I remember, I'll just share a moment. Mark Gilman and Sonny and I went chukar hunting over in eastern Washington. And I don't know if you've ever been chukar hunting or not. It takes place on a hillside about like this. And if you're familiar with eastern Washington, you're going by these dry hills, you'll see great swaths of just rocks, of rock fall. It's just big boulders that are just there, and then there's grass in other places. And so I was walking, we were walking across, or I was walking across the hill, so I could see Sonny. Sonny wasn't climbing that hill. He was down on the bottom. And I flushed up a chucker and shot and killed it on the other side of these rocks. So I got to go get it. So as I'm walking across, the rocks begin to move. And I begin to move faster, sideways, thinking, I hope I don't cause an avalanche and kill Sonny down the bottom. But I really thought this is it. And that's just one time. I mean, I could name maybe 2 or 3 times that I felt like I was going to die. How often did Paul face that? Frequently. Often. Again and again. Again, Palakis, many times, frequently or often. So there's his first paragraph of the newspaper about his suffering. Okay, we have the headline, you know, if you're an apostle, this is what's going to happen, and then you have beatings and prisons and labors, and now deaths. Mike, you look like you're wanting to say something.
Patty wants to know what a chucker is.
It's a partridge, a little bit smaller than a hen pheasant.
Chucker cherries.
Huh?
I think chucker on chucker cherries.
It's Chukar. If you've ever been to Pike Place Market, there's a chocolate candy place. It's called Chucker. And it's got a picture of Chucker on it. You can look it up. You know, Google it after class. You'll see one. They're nice and they're tasty. They're good birds. I love them.
Why those rocks were moving.
Because I was on top of them, and they're just laying there. So when I started moving them, then they started going away. All right, let's look at verses. Any comments on the in death? Does everybody understand what he's meaning there?
Yeah, I got a comment.
Okay.
I get your story, and I've been in similar situations where you're kind of watching death come your way, and you go, "Oh, today's the day."
Right.
You know, and still, all situations are even more like he's in much more severe, like getting the life beaten out of him, spending a day and night in the cold, reaching hypothermic levels,
Right.
and not knowing
Right.
how many more days till I die.
Right.
You know, and so like not to minimize any of our close to death situations, but his were like people trying to kill him or execute him,
Right.
or like just a very hopeless
Right.
life and death situation.
Right. Well, and he's gonna as we go through the rest of this more detailed report, I just want you to think, how many times could he have died when he talks about this thing or this thing or this thing that happened to him, and you'll kind of appreciate what he said. All right, verses 24 through 26 then says, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open. See, I have been, let's see here, one more. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. So, to begin with, he says 5 times he was beaten by the Jews. And I meant to look up the Greek here. I do have the Greek. I did make notes of it. It says 40 minus 1. The word lashes is not in the Greek. But if you're beaten by the Jews, 40 minus 1, we know what he's talking about. Jesus warned the apostles, not Paul because he wasn't in that group, but in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 17, somebody else can open to Mark 3 and verse 9 and be ready for that. Matthew 10:17 says, "Be on your guard, you will be handed over local councils and be flogged in the synagogues." If you're being flogged in the synagogues, who's flogging you? The Jews are. Who has Mark 3:9? Okay, Sam?
And he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd lest they crush him.
Okay. So that's the same kind of a word there. Listen, how often did Paul go to synagogues?
Every time he entered a new city.
Every time he went to a city, if there were Jews there. And 11 times we have in the book of Acts that Paul went to a synagogue. We specifically stated that he went to the synagogue. So if Jesus says you're going to be flogged when you go to a synagogue, and what's Paul's first port of call in a city? The synagogue. What does he know could happen every time? Every time he goes to a synagogue, it could end up being flogged. And we know apparently from this, 5 times it did not go well when he went to the synagogue. It didn't turn out good for Paul. One could be, let's go over, let me just again give you these. Acts 13, verses 45 and 50. Somebody can just read both of those verses for me. Acts 13:45, who has it? Okay, go ahead, then you read verse 50 afterwards, Mike.
But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began contradicting the things spoken by Paul and were blaspheming. And 50, but the Jews incited the devout women of prominence and the leading men of the city and instigated a persecution against Paul and Barnabas and drove them out of their district.
Okay, so they instituted a persecution and drove them out. But we don't have any official Jewish floggings in the book of Acts. None of those are recorded there for us. Where does 40 minus 1 come from? Sam?
The Roman law.
No.
No?
No. As soon as the word Roman came out of your mouth, I knew that you weren't correct. Josh?
Well, wasn't it the limit if they got 39 lashes and you died, they weren't guilty?
No, that's not it either. Mike?
Jewish law,
There you go.
so they couldn't do more than 40.
Right.
But in case they miscounted, they would stop at 39.
Right.
to Make sure they didn't go.
It was just their tradition. Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. Says, when people have a dispute, they are to take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make them lie down and have them flogged in his presence with the number of lashes the crime deserves. But the judge must not impose more than 40 lashes, which means he could impose 40 lashes. It just can't be more than 40 lashes. Okay? So can it be 41? No. But could it be 40? Yes. If the guilty party is flogged more than that, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes. And so God said no more than 40. Well, what's the possibility? You know, you're right around that 37, 38 number, and if somebody loses count, you know, do you want to do 41? No, because that's a violation. So in typical Jewish Pharisaic, that's not Pharisaic in this particular time period. But where would you then decide, okay, this is a safe place to stop? 39. 39. Safe place to stop for you. Okay, John?
It's like a baker's dozen, but just in
The other direction, yes. Mike?
Is this an interpretation? Because it seems like by the writers, because it seems like I'm looking at the Greek word and the same word is used for a fast of 40 days and 40 nights. The same word, it looks like.
Right.
And then, so when they say 40, the Jewish people must mean 39. Is that?
No, they meant 40, but it was a tradition for them to go one short. So they didn't get 41 accidentally.
The interpreter, or the person who translated this thing, put 39 in my translation.
Yes, then that's wrong, because the words in Greek are 40 minus 1. And if it's not, then somebody, I'm sure that it's 40 minus 1.
Yeah, yes, 40, 40, and then it says para and heis. And
Yeah, minus 1, right. Heis is 1. So rabbinic sources list several offenses meriting flogging, and according to the law, none deserve more than 40. According to this law, none deserve more than 40. Now, what do you suppose would merit flogging by the Jews? Just an idea.
Disrespecting a rabbi?
Okay, that'd be one. Let me just throw one out to you here. Adultery, you get stoned.
Oh, that's true.
Right. You've just been spending too much time with Gentiles.
Too much time on.
With Gentiles. You need to not be spending so much time with Gentiles. We think that's flogging offense. Okay? I think that's why he got so many. Or at least part of the reason. Perceived ritual uncleanness. Maybe because of his message that he's preaching, like message that Stephen preached. What did Stephen get for his message? Yeah, he got stoned. But maybe if they're feeling a little generous, they would just flog you and not stone you. Now, knowing that 5 times, every time he goes to a synagogue, he's walking into a potential flogging, future flogging. What did Paul not cease to do? He not cease going into synagogues and preaching the gospel. Why would he do that?
I think he trusted that God's going to keep him alive as long as God needs.
Okay, yeah, well, God's going to keep him alive, but he's still going to be flogged at least 5 times.
Because there was more value to him to spread the gospel.
Okay? What did we just read in Romans, in our study of Romans?
I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Okay, so that's in chapter 1. What did he say later on about condemnation of his brothers? What would he be willing to do?
Oh, you go to hell.
Yeah, he'd be willing to go to hell for them if it would mean to say them to be saved. I will take the condemnation if my brethren, according to the flesh, can be saved. That's how much he loves his brothers. So you think if he's willing to die and die eternally for them, that he might be willing to do something lesser, which is get 39 stripes? Yeah.
I have to imagine going up. I mean, just the way we confront, like, an impending, like, pain and conflict like that. He has to be talking to his traveling companions. You think I'm going to get flogged to this one?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Listen,
How do you think this is going to go, guys?
I mean, I don't like to go to the dentist,
Yeah.
okay? And they're going to numb me up,
Uh-huh.
okay? Let alone going into a place thinking, this could be 39 before I'm done. 39 stripes. So the next thing, 3 times he was beaten with rods. We do know one of those times. That's Acts 16, 22, and 23 when he's in Philippi with Silas. Beaten with rods is something that's publicly done. You're not taken out in the woodshed. I mean, this happens right in public. It's done before the bema, the judgment seat there. It's done by professional lictors, people that are trained to inflict the greatest amount of pain. Generally, traditionally here, it was done with beechwood or birchwood rods. It was frequent but not usually done to Roman citizens, okay, which is the problem the people in Philippi had. And when they do it to a Roman citizen, then you can see the chagrin. 3 times that happened to Paul. What's the difference between being beaten by rods by Gentiles and being flogged by a Jew?
The person who's doing it?
Pardon me?
The person who's doing it?
Well, I mean, that's obviously true. How many stripes do you think Jesus got when he was beaten?
They don't count.
They don't count. They don't have to count. They don't have a law that says they have to count. So the reason Paul mentions 40 minus 1 from the Jews is because apparently he got the full measure from them that they could do by tradition. When he says beaten with rods 3 times, does he Does he say how many times they hit him? No, because there was no limit. They probably want to take you just as close to dying as they could without killing you. So that was 3 times. What's the next one?
Stoned.
Once I was stoned, and we know that one. That's Acts 14 in Lystra. And this is done by angry Jews from neighboring cities that have come down to try to drag him or push him completely out of the region. This is not an official synagogue stoning. This is a mob of Jews with Gentiles that are hitting him with rocks. And again, what's the purpose of stoning somebody? You want to kill them. I mean, you're talking, not throwing gravel at them. You got fist-sized rocks that you're throwing. So far what we've looked at, how many times could you have died? All of them. All of them. Do they have antiseptic for when you've been all flogged for 39 stripes? I don't think so. Okay, next thing, what is it? Shipwrecked. How many times? 3 times he was shipwrecked. And at least one of those, I don't think this is an additional one. How long was he in the water? A night and a day. So, 24 hours? Again, I pointed this out last week. The only one that we have in Acts, only shipwreck we have in Acts is in Acts 27, and that post-dates when Paul wrote this. So I know that he was shipwrecked at least 4 times. And Paul traveled a lot by sea, probably more than we realize. And the potential for mishaps was common. How many lifeboats did they have on those boats? Probably not enough, if any. I mean, the one boat that he was in in Acts 27 had a small tender boat that they were pulling behind. I don't know if you'd call it a lifeboat or not. Yeah, the sailors, when the boat was going down, looked at it as a lifeboat, but that got removed. And one time again, he was floating around on parts of the shipwreck for a whole day. Is that a near-death experience? Listen, anytime if you fall off a ship in the ocean or the sea, because they're not a long ways from land, but they're probably far enough that you wouldn't be able to swim it, like fully dressed with the clothing that they had on. And listen, that people didn't know how to swim. Did you know that the British Navy didn't teach their sailors how to swim? You know why?
The boat was down.
Kept them on the ship.
Oh, well.
Kept them in there fighting. Because if you can swim, what will you do? You'll jump and bail and leave. Okay? Again, we're going to have these in prepositional phrases. In perils. Kendunos is the Greek word. It's a danger or peril or risk. And again, most of these are a result of journeying. The Greek for in dangers or perils is hodoporia, which means journeying or wayfaring. Hodos means the way, and poria means to travel, so it would be the same as our road trips. Typically, that refers to walking. When Jesus was walking around in John the 4th chapter in verse 6, it says he was weary. That's going to happen. Paul did walk through Syria, started at Antioch, went up north, and came all the way through Cilicia, up into Galatia, and on into Asia Minor. Wanted to go up in Pontus, wanted to go down into Asia, and was taken all the way around to Troas, where he got the vision to go to Philippi. All of that's overland. All of that was walking. The next in is in journeyings often. So he's constantly on the move. And we have an 8-fold list keyed by the word danger here. So when he says in danger, often, the danger is on all of these. He's in danger from rivers, because you have to cross them. And you have to cross them probably without or a bridge. You're wading across this river. And in danger from bandits. Because where you're going, I mean, he's going to where the gospel needs to be taken. He's traveling overland. These are clearly dangers of life on the road, fording rivers where bridges are non-existent. When you're crossing them, it's possible to lose supplies because you're probably carrying those on your back. Sickness from getting wet and not being able to dry out. Harm from creatures of the water. I don't know if they have crocodiles in that part of the world. Probably not. But the danger of drowning, the dangers of fighting the current. Yeah, I don't think there's sharks in rivers. But and listen, we have the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, because of the soldiers and everything. But he would have to have been traveling in less populated areas that weren't as guarded and protected by the armies. His next pair is in dangers from my own countrymen and in dangers from Gentiles. So that he's saying all of mankind, Jews and Gentiles. And in the book of Acts, who's the greater danger, the Jew or the Gentile? The Jews. Very much so. Gentiles seem to be less antagonistic initially, but they could be still be violent.
Except the silversmiths, right?
Pardon me? Yes. So, especially in a pagan culture and a pagan economy like that, and if you're impinging on their livelihood or their religion, yes, they could be testy about that. Then we have a triplet: in danger in the city, in danger in the country, and in danger at sea. I don't think you could be anywhere else. You're either on the sea or in the country or in the city. And the first two cover just about everywhere Paul might have traveled by foot, including those places that were inhabited and those that were not. And then the third covers everything else of traveling by water. And again, Paul said all of these things he's described happened to him. What's the next one?
False brothers.
Okay, false brothers. And my translation has in dangers from false believers. And that's unfortunate. It shouldn't be believers there. The Greek is pseudo-delphos. Pseudo means false. Delphos is brother, like Philadelphia, lovely brothers. And this one doesn't really have a match. And it's the last in this list that he gives us here. But it's not only the last, it's also what? We sometimes say last, but not least. In this case, it's last, but compared to all the rest of them, Paul's basically finishing up this list by saying this is the worst. Who would you expect to have problems from? Would you expect to have problems from your brothers? And of course, they're false brothers. But it's not coming from a source you would have expected. And the danger that they are displaying is treachery.
The wolves in sheep's clothing.
Yes.
Those kinds of things.
Yes. And really, I think Paul's not so concerned about himself here as he is concerned about the church and what's happening to that. And he's already described these other guys that are in Corinth as false apostles, as ministers of Satan. And I think he hopes they're going to cringe when he says that, false brethren. And maybe cause the Corinthians to cringe a little bit because they've been tolerating them. Because they're contributing to the risk of the church. They are another drag on Paul's ministry. This is another thing that he has to be concerned about and worried about. And the only other place this word is found is like a couple pages over in your Bible in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 4, where they were trying to compel, while they were in Jerusalem in Acts 15. He said, this matter arose because some false believers or false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ and to make us slaves. Again, from Acts 14, it seems like these guys follow Paul along. They come along behind him and cause problems and try to catch him and move him out. Did you have a comment, Daniel?
Are we picturing, how do I put this? People like the Pharisees who, it's like like Paul actually was at one point. He's so committed to his discipleship, to following God, that he was blinded by the truth and was therefore committing all sorts of atrocities.
Right.
Or is it more like we read of in other places where there are people that are doing things totally out of selfish gain?
Yeah, I don't think that these are, I'm not saying that that's not possible, but I think these guys are probably Pharisaic, who have come to faith in Jesus, like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea and Paul, but they are also at the same time wedded to the law and they can't give that up. So they're the variety of people that say, sure, we'll let Gentiles come in, they can all be Jews, or all be Christians, but they have to become Jews first. They have to arrange themselves under the law, and they're not willing to give that up. I mean, 1,500 years of tradition is pretty hard to just walk away from.
Dan?
Yes.
Revelation 12:13, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. And is that a picture of what's happening here, where the devil, I think, may be directing these and trying, if we can stamp out this, this group of babes in Christ,
Right.
get rid of this whole thing forever. And,
Sure.
and so he was trying to do that.
Right.
God was protecting, I have many in the city,
Right.
and making sure that
Well, what did he call them earlier in chapter 11? Ministers of who?
ministers of Satan.
Ministers of Satan. So that's exactly right. Jonathan?
It just stood out to me in this moment. I've never really thought of it before, but the wisdom of God is shown in that of all the apostles, the one who was a Pharisee among Pharisees was sent to the Gentiles.
Right.
Not one of the ones
Right.
who walked with Christ, who Pharisees might have said, well, he was abandoning the Jewish traditions, but one who held to those traditions longer.
At the other end of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who before, we see Peter had some scruples about going into with Gentiles, in Acts 10. And the Holy Spirit he had to have a huge vision to tell him, you don't call what I call clean unclean, ever. And then when these guys come, another added layer, you go with them, don't asking any questions. But the first words out of his mouth in Corinth or in Caesarea are what? You know that it's unlawful for me to be here. Okay? So I don't know what most of the apostles' political affiliations were with regards to their Judaism, but we have no doubts about Saul of Tarsus and Paul. He's the one that says, I'm a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. So at this point in time, Paul adds these false brothers to his list of hardships, the very end. And they deserve to be added here. They are a huge problem for him. And again, I feel like maybe I feel like I need to do this because I have for so long misapplied this text, that he's not comparing himself, Paul is not comparing himself to the 12 apostles, the faithful apostles. He would never do that, ever. And he's not comparing, when he says, I suffered more than all of them, he's not saying I suffered more than Thomas and Philip. You know, ask those guys how much they've suffered. I've suffered more. He's not talking about them. He's talking about these false apostles that are here in Corinth. So as he continues here, he's not saying he worked harder than the rest of the true apostles. He's focused on these false apostles. So verses 27 and 28. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. And I would add that in this list, Paul often adds the words in again and often. We don't translate it because it becomes redundant for us in English. But this list would be headlined by labor and toils, or labored and toiled. And he's already mentioned that he worked and labored harder than others. So these terms refer to physical as well as mental stress of his work as an apostle, of the work that's intrinsically tied to being an apostle. He's gone without sleep. What would cause that? Yeah, wounds, working, being wet and cold, concerned for the churches, having to work nights to make ends meet. And we talked about that before when in Acts 16. If he's having to work, laboring with hand to support himself, when can he teach people? At night. And so he did that. Sleeplessness can also be caused by hunger and thirst.
He's trying to heal without proper nutrition.
Oh, yes. And when he says I'm going without hunger and thirst, I mean, sometimes if a person voluntarily does that, we call it what? Fasting. And there may have been times when he fasted. But that's not what he's talking about here. It would be included in that. But in verse 9, for instance, of our text, and when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone. Maybe he needed food, but he didn't ask for it.
Fasting is voluntary.
Yes. Yeah, this is forced. Probably even more so. I mean, when we're traveling today, in your car, going across country, you'll get a little warning, last gas for 200 miles, last food for, they don't have that. He's traveling through remote areas where there may not be any food or any availability for food on land or sea. And that's just part and parcel of the missionary work he was doing. He goes on, says cold and naked. The naked probably reinforces the cold. He doesn't have enough clothing to keep warm.
Dan?
Yes.
So in New King James, it's in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's in.
Yeah, I don't think that mine just says, I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think Paul's listing out here hardships, not things, as John said, not things he's voluntarily done. I mean, in Acts chapter 9, I know he fasted for 3 days and praying because he realizes what he's done. That he wouldn't have included that in here, I don't think. Or you could have your clothing that got wet when you crossed a river and you didn't have any spare to put on. So you just have to wear what you have. Which is why, remember, somebody turn to 2 Timothy 3 and verse 13 and read it before Sam bleeds the bell.
Before I give you the book?
You can give me the hook, I don't care. 2 Timothy 3:13. You okay, Jonathan?
While evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived.
Is that 2 Timothy?
2 Timothy 3:13.
Okay, maybe it's 4:13. I'm talking about the fact when he wanted to have his cloak picked up. 4:13.
Yes. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments.
Okay, bring the cloak. Come on, Paul, how many, don't you, all of us have more than one cloak. I have to talk to Tammy about leaving pens that have no ink in them. It's okay, she's got one right next door that does. I'm going to change this to 4 real quick. Because otherwise, tomorrow night, I'll say 3:13 again.
Sometimes they only write in circles.
Yeah. So let's begin. Let's begin next week with what he talks about, his concern for the churches. I thought we'd get further tonight, but this is pretty exciting stuff. I will be sending out the next lesson. I've got that ready to go. So please download it this weekend when I send out the Zoom invitations, and take a look at the next section. The next section is just chapters 12, 1 through 10. The end of this list of hardships and suffering, and it has to do with his vision that he had and his thorn in the flesh. That'll be the next lesson that we're dealing with. So, but we'll start there next week. Any questions real quick? Thank you very much.